The wind cut like razors across the snow-covered ruins of what was once a proud German defensive line. Private Hans Müller, barely 22, knew these would be his owl moments. The Soviet artillery had been thundering for days, each explosion drawing closer, methodically erasing everything in their path. He remembered his mother's tearful goodbye in Stuttgart. How distant that memory seemed now, here on the frozen Eastern Front, where hope had become a luxury no soldier could afford. His jaws, numb inside thin leather gloves, clutched the worn carabiner 98 rifle, his only companion in this landscape of destruction. The temperature hovered around -15 degrees, a cold so intense it seemed to strip away humanity, reducing everything to pure survival. Hans had seen veteran soldiers break under less pressure, men who had fought since Poland, who had marched through Russia's endless plains, now reduced to desperate, haunted shells. Reconnaissance reports from the previous night confirmed the worst. 3 Soviet armies were converging, their combined strength overwhelming any remaining German defensive positions. Intelligence suggested they were facing at least 300,000 Soviet troops against fewer than 60,000 exhausted German soldiers. His unit had been decimated weeks ago. What remained was a patchwork of survivors from different regiments, united by a single desperate goal: survival. Some were teenagers, others grizzled veterans who had seen too much death. They shared cigarettes, sparse rations, and an unspoken understanding that their chances were minimal. The landscape told a story of total war. Burned-out tanks, frozen corpses, abandoned equipment scattered like discarded toys across the white terrain. Every building was a potential shelter, every shadow a potential threat. The Soviet advance was relentless, methodical, crushing everything in its path. Hans thought about the propaganda that had brought him here. The promises of glory, of expanding German territory, of creating a new world order. Those dreams now seemed like a cruel joke. Reality was much simpler, staying alive for one more hour, one more day. His unit's last radio communication had been grim. Central Command offered no extraction, no reinforcements. They were essentially abandoned, expected to hold their position or die trying. Standard military protocol in these desperate stages of the war. Food was scarce. They had been surviving on minimal rations, some dried bread, occasional horse meat, and whatever could be scavenged from abandoned villages. Water was collected by melting snow, a risky process that exposed them to potential sniper fire. Hans pulled out a crumpled photograph of his family, his mother, his younger sister, the small farmhouse in the Black Forest region. Would he ever see them again? The photograph was his only connection to a world that now seemed impossibly distant and peaceful. The sound of distant tanks broke his momentary reflection. Soviet T-34s, their engines growling like mechanical predators, were approaching. Hans could feel the ground trembling, a rhythmic warning of imminent destruction. His training kicked in. Beatons, check ammunition, secure defensive position, maintain composure. Around him, other soldiers prepared with a mixture of terror and grim determination. Some prayed silently. Others checked their weapons with mechanical precision. They knew the odds. They understood the brutality that was about to unfold. A veteran sergeant named Müller, no relation to Hans, moved between positions, offering brief words of encouragement. Hold your ground. Make them pay for every meter. His ice was rough, carrying the weight of years of combat. The first Soviet shells began to fall, transforming the landscape into a hellscape of explosions and flying debris. Smoke and fire mixed with the pristine white snow, creating a surreal battlefield that defied all previous understanding of combat. Hans took a deep breath. These would be his hours. Not as a hero, not as a symbol of any grand ideology, but simply as a human being trying to survive in circumstances beyond his control. The battle was about to begin. The first Soviet infantry emerged from behind smoldering tanks, their white camouflage blending seamlessly with the snow. Dark figures moving like phantoms, carrying PPS-41 submachine guns and grenades. Hans gripped his Kar 98K rifle, his gaze nearly numb inside thin leather gloves. The first wave crashed against their defensive line like a human tide. Muzzle flashes erupted across the white landscape, creating momentary bursts of violent illumination. Müller was shouting commands, his ice cutting through the cacophony of gunfire and explosions. Hans targeted a Soviet soldier running between destroyed buildings, his breath creating small clouds in the freezing air. He squeezed the trigger, watched the man fall. No satisfaction, just cold calculation. Survival depended on precision, not emotion. Around him, German positions were being systematically reduced. Machine gun nests provided temporary resistance, but the Soviet advance seemed inexorable. They had numbers, they had momentum, they had a savage determination born of years of German invasion and brutality. A grenade landed 20 meters from Hans' position. He dove, feeling the ground shake, hearing the sharp metallic burst. Fragments whistled past, some embedding in nearby snow. Dust and smoke created a chaotic visual landscape. Müller was hit moments later. A burst from a Soviet submachine gun caught him in the chest. He didn't cry out, minds just slumped against a frozen stone wall. His eyes still open, still watching the battle unfold. Another veteran fallen. Another story ended. Hans realized their situation was hopeless. The defensive line was collapsing faster than anyone had anticipated. Soviet tanks were now closer, their massive treads crushing abandoned equipment and frozen ground alike. Each tank represented not just machinery but mobile artillery capable of devastating their remaining positions. Radio communication had become sporadic. Occasional bursts of static mixed with desperate German and Russian ices. Command structures were disintegrating. Individual soldiers were becoming the primary decision-makers, their survival dependent on immediate tactical choices. A young soldier named Klaus, barely 20 years old, was crying next to Hans. Not from fear precisely, but from the overwhelming sensory assault. The noise, the destruction, the sudden randomness of death. Hans placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture more practical than comforting. "Keep your position," he said quietly. "Watch your sectors, stay alert." Klaus nodded, wiping his face with a snow-crusted sleeve. His hands were shaking as he reloaded his weapon. The Soviet advance seemed almost mathematical in its precision. They weren't just attacking. They were methodically destroying every potential German defensive position. Mortar teams provided continuous supporting fire, creating zones of destruction that shifted and expanded like living organisms. Hans thought about the broader context of this battle. This wasn't just a local engagement, this represented the potential end of Nazi Germany's Eastern Campaign. Years of brutal invasion, of scorched earth policies, of unimaginable atrocities, all culminating in this moment of total defeat. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same military machine that had marched confidently eastward just years earlier was now being systematically dismantled. Propaganda about racial superiority, about unstoppable German military might, all of it crumbling like the buildings around them. Another explosion. Closer this time. Hans could feel fragments of ice and rock striking his helmet, his jacket. The sensory overload was becoming almost abstract as sound, heat, movement blending into a surreal battlefield experience. Soviet troops were now moving between buildings, using cover with practiced efficiency. They understood urban combat in a way that seemed almost intuitive. Every movement calculated, every position strategically chosen. Hans knew their remaining ammunition wouldn't last much longer. Each shot had to count. Each defensive position was temporary, a momentary obstruction in the Soviet advance. The temperature continued dropping. Paradoxically, the cold might become as deadly as any Soviet bullet. Hypothermia was a silent enemy, more patient and consistent than any human combatant. More Soviet tanks rolled forward. Their massive forms created shadows across the snow, mechanical monsters consuming the landscape. Hans could hear their engines, feel their vibrations through the frozen ground. This was no longer a battle. This was a systematic elimination. The Soviet tanks stopped momentarily. A brief moment of stillness descended over the battlefield, more ominous than any previous noise. Hans understood this pause. It was tactical, calculating. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, broken, cracked. Its sound seemed to echo the destruction surrounding them. Klaus suddenly grabbed Hans' arm. "They're preparing something," he whispered. Hans nodded. The veteran soldier's instincts were razor-sharp. Years of combat had taught him that silence often preceded the most devastating attacks. A massive artillery barrage erupted. The ground shook. Buildings that had survived decades suddenly disintegrated into clouds of dust and splintered wood. Hans and Klaus were thrown backward, their bodies hitting a partially collapsed wall. Deafness came first, then pain, then a strange disconnected awareness. Hans realized he was bleeding. A fragment of shrapnel had torn through his left shoulder. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but in these conditions, infection would be a death sentence. Klaus was unconscious, his young face covered in dust and blood. Hans dragged him behind what remained of their defensive position. His movements mechanical, practiced. The Soviet advance resumed. Methodical, relentless. Hans understood now that this wasn't just a battle. This was the AL chapter of something much larger. The complete dismantling of Nazi Germany's eastern ambitions. Every meter of ground lost represented not just territorial defeat, but the collapse of an entire ideological construct. Through the smoke and chaos, Hans saw Soviet soldiers moving, not with rage, not with vengeance, but with a cold professional efficiency that was almost surgical. They were cleaning up, eliminating the last pockets of resistance. His thoughts drifted to his family in Munich, to the years of propaganda, to the promises of victory that had driven millions of young men like Klaus into this meat grinder of a war. Another explosion. Closer. Hans knew their chances of survival were minimal, but survival had never been the point. Survival was a luxury neither side could afford in this moment. The Soviet tanks continued their advance, their treads crushing not just snow and rock but the last remnants of Nazi military might. Darkness began falling. The temperature dropped further, a merciful cold that would soon numb pain. Silence suffering. Hans checked Klaus. The young soldier was breathing, barely. In that moment, Hans understood the true tragedy of war, not the grand narratives, not the ideological battles, but the individual human cost. Young men like Klaus, caught in machinery far larger than themselves. The Soviet soldiers were closer now. Hans could hear their conversations, not triumphant, not celebratory, just matter-of-fact communication between men doing a job. He gripped his weapon, not with hope of victory, but with a defiant gesture of human dignity. The last battle was ending, and with it an entire chapter of human history would close. Silence approached, soft, inevitable, complete. A distant whistle cut through the settling dust. A Soviet officer approached, his footsteps deliberate. Hans didn't move. Klaus remained unconscious. The officer was younger than Hans expected, mid-30s. Eyes that had seen too much. He stopped 10 meters away, surveying the scene with a detached precision. "Surrender," he said in German, not a command, more like a statement of inevitable fact. Hans looked down at Klaus. The boy's breathing was shallow. A thin line of blood traced his cheekbone. "He needs medical attention," Hans said quietly. The Soviet officer nodded. No emotion, just recognition of a human necessity. Another soldier approached, carrying a medical kit. They moved Klaus carefully, checking his wounds with professional efficiency. Hans remained still, his wounded shoulder throbbing. No dramatic confrontation. No Hollywood heroics. Just the quiet mechanics of war's aftermath. As they prepared to evacuate Klaus, the officer looked directly at Hans. No hatred, no triumph. Just a shared understanding of war's fundamental absurdity. "The Reich is ischt," the officer said. Hans didn't respond. What was there to say? The snow continued falling, soft, indifferent, covering the battlefield's scars with a pristine white blanket that would by spring reveal nothing of the violence that had transpired. Klaus would survive. Barely. Hans would spend years in a Soviet prisoner camp. The world would change completely. But in this moment, there was only silence, and snow, and the slow, inexorable march of history. The last fragments of an empire dissolved into whiteness. The Soviet camp was brutal but not inhuman. Hans learned this gradually through small gestures and unexpected moments of compassion. Prisoners worked, survived, shared whatever scraps of hope they could dead. Years later, when he was ally released, Munich was unrecognizable, rebuilt, modern. The weight of history hung everywhere, invisible but palpable. He never sought revenge, never joined veteran groups or political movements. Instead, he became a quiet carpenter, rebuilding things, furniture, homes, small pieces of a broken world. Klaus survived too. They met once, years after the war, in a small cafe in Stuttgart. No grand speeches, no emotional reunion, just two men who had shared something fundamental modern, a moment when humanity transcended ideology. They spoke little, drank coffee, acknowledged each other with a subtle nod that contained entire lifetimes of understanding. The war had taken everything, and yet somehow something remained, something fragile, something human. As evening settled over the city, Hans looked out the window. The light was soft, gentle, the way light sometimes is after long darkness. He realized then that survival was not just about remaining alive, it was about maintaining something inside oneself, something unbreakable, a quiet dignity.